Landon Parker was minding his own business, parking in a crowded lot, when a woman named Helen Stratford approached him with venom in her eyes. Her words, filled with scorn, accused him of invading spaces you don't belong. Before he could even defend himself, she slapped him across the face in front of a growing crowd. The sting of the slap was nothing compared to the shock, but when he tried to stand his ground, the consequences were worse than he could have imagined. But before we dive deeper into this explosive story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future stories. The air hummed with the sound of car engines and muffled conversations, filling the space with an unmistakable vibrancy typical of a Saturday afternoon. People rushed in and out of stores, their footsteps quick and purposeful, while the occasional group lingered by the coffee shop, lost in laughter and idle chatter. The plaza, a hub for locals and visitors alike, carried a sense of urgency mixed with the familiarity of weekend routines. Landon Parker, after a grueling 2-hour drive from the outskirts of Central City, finally found a parking spot in the crowded lot. The engine of his aging sedan clicked off, and he let out a sigh, stretching his stiff limbs. A glance at his phone confirmed the time. He was right on schedule. Lunch with Mia, he thought, his body sagging slightly with relief. Just 1 hour of peace, that's all I need today. He ran a hand through his short, dark hair, trying to shake off the fatigue that had accumulated over the long drive. He had a reputation for keeping his cool, an unshakable calm that many of his friends and colleagues envied. But deep down, he was starting to feel the weight of his responsibilities pressing in on him. Landon was in his early 30s, a software developer by trade. He spent most of his days behind a computer screen, building systems for a tech company. The work was demanding, often pulling him into long hours of problem-solving and collaboration. While he enjoyed the intellectual challenges of his job, it left little room for personal time. That was why this lunch with Mia, his younger sister, was a rare but precious moment of respite. Mia was a law student, brimming with energy and optimism. She had been through a lot, especially recently, and Landon wanted to be there for her, offering a semblance of normalcy in an increasingly complicated world. After securing the car, Landon grabbed his phone and checked his reflection in the side mirror, making sure his shirt was neatly pressed. As he straightened his collar, his attention was drawn to the sharp, rhythmic clicking of heels against the pavement. It was the kind of sound that demanded attention, echoing in the space like a warning. Landon turned his head, just as a woman approached, her posture straight, her heels striking the ground with purpose. Helen Stratford appeared before him like a force of nature. In her mid-40s, she carried herself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Dressed in a tailored blazer, black trousers, and designer heels, she seemed to belong to a world far removed from the casual chaos of the plaza. Her sharp, calculating gaze made Landon feel as though she had sized him up in an instant, measuring him in a way that unsettled him. Her expression was one of controlled judgment, a kind of predatory grace that felt out of place in this otherwise ordinary setting. There was something unnerving about the way she moved, each step deliberate, each glance purposeful. Landon froze momentarily as she approached him, his instincts alerting him to the tension in the air. As he began to unlock his car, the woman's voice broke through the hum of the plaza, sharp and demanding. "Excuse me, you! Yes, you!" Her tone was curt, with no room for negotiation. Landon blinked, caught off guard. It was as though the whole world around him had shifted focus, all eyes drawn to him by her command. His thoughts scrambled, but he quickly masked his confusion with a calm exterior. "Ma'am, is there an issue with my parking?" he asked, his voice steadied despite the knot forming in his stomach. He glanced briefly at his car, noting that it was parked perfectly within the lines. Nothing about his actions seemed out of the ordinary, so why was she singling him out? The woman's eyes narrowed, her lips forming a thin, disapproving line. She stood a few feet away from him now, arms crossed over her chest, her stance rigid. It was as if she had become a gatekeeper to some unspoken territory, her entire presence radiating authority. For a split second, Landon felt the urge to walk away, to leave her to whatever issue she had in her head. But he didn't. Instead, he stood his ground, determined not to be intimidated. It was a moment that would linger longer than either of them anticipated. Landon stood frozen, startled by the unexpected hostility in Helen's tone. He had encountered difficult people in the past, customers, colleagues, even strangers, but this felt different. There was a palpable tension in the air, a pressure that tightened around him as her eyes locked onto his with an almost predatory intensity. Helen, her posture still rigid, closed the remaining gap between them. Her presence was suffocating, almost as though the space between them was shrinking with every passing second. She stopped just a few feet away, crossing her arms like a gatekeeper protecting some unseen border. Her glare was fierce, her voice low but biting. "Do you think this is acceptable?" she spat, her words cutting through the surrounding noise. "Parking here? Coming here at all?" "Oh boy." Landon blinked in confusion, glancing back at his car, which was parked neatly between the lines, a model of proper parking etiquette. There was nothing about his arrival that stood out as unusual or disrespectful. The lot was crowded, but he had found an empty spot and followed the basic rules. "Ma'am, I don't see an issue," he replied, his voice calm, though a knot formed in his stomach. "Is something wrong?" But Helen wasn't satisfied with his response. Her jaw tightened as she stepped even closer, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. The crowd around them seemed to disappear, the moment narrowing down to just the two of them. She lowered her voice, but it was no less venomous, each word dripping with contempt as though she were exposing a wound. "This isn't about parking," she said, her voice cold and deliberate, as if carefully choosing every word. "It's about people like you thinking you can invade spaces where you clearly don't belong." Susan nodded. The words landed like a slap, the force of them striking Landon with a sudden weight. He felt his chest tighten, his breath catching in his throat. For a brief moment, his vision blurred, the world around him slowing. There was a visceral sting to the accusation, something deeper than just a critique of his actions. It felt personal, as though Helen wasn't speaking about parking at all, but about something far more profound, his very right to be here. Landon stiffened, fighting the instinct to lash out, to respond with the same venom, but he kept his jaw clenched and his posture controlled, the way his father had taught him in moments like this. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you lose control. His palms were sweating, but he fought against the rising tide of anger and fear, trying to focus on the conversation at hand. "I'm here to meet someone for lunch," he said, his voice steady but low. He was aware of the eyes around them, the increasing number of people who had begun to gather, watching the scene unfold. "I'm not looking for trouble." But Helen wasn't listening anymore. Her gaze hardened further, and she seemed almost to disregard his words entirely. It was as though her mind had already made its judgment, and nothing he could say would change it. She stood there, arms crossed, as if daring him to challenge her, to push back in some way. The crowd, now clearly intrigued, stood in silence, unsure whether they should intervene or simply watch this strange, escalating interaction. Landon felt the weight of their stares, the feeling of being on display, like some kind of animal caught in a trap. He took a breath, trying to ignore the growing unease in his chest, the feeling that things were about to spiral in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Helen's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible sneer. The air between them crackled with hostility. Landon's grip on his phone tightened, the device suddenly feeling like a lifeline, though he wasn't sure why. He wasn't going to get into a shouting match. He wasn't going to allow this woman to dictate the situation any more than she already had. Still, the words she had spoken echoed in his head, piercing through his calm exterior like a dagger. "People like you, invading spaces you don't belong." What did she mean by that? Before Landon could formulate any response, the space around them seemed to shift again, the crowd subtly pulling back as if preparing for the next move in this tense chess match. The tension between them hung thick in the air, but it was Helen who broke the silence. Her voice rose, sharp and purposeful, cutting through the ambient noise of the plaza. The change was immediate and striking. Where she had been cold and composed moments before, she now spoke with a venomous edge that made the surrounding people stop and take notice. "Trouble," she mocked, her words laced with disdain. "You've already brought trouble just by being here." Her eyes narrowed, her posture rigid with indignation. "Some of us have worked hard to build this community, and we don't need it disrupted by people like you." Her words were calculated, designed to make Landon feel small and unwelcome. She wasn't just confronting him over a minor issue. She was accusing him of being an intruder, someone who didn't belong in the space he occupied. The phrase, "people like you," hung in the air, and Landon's heart skipped a beat. It was as though Helen wasn't just speaking about the parking lot, but about something deeper, something more personal. The weight of her judgment was suffocating. And as her voice echoed, a few nearby shoppers slowed their pace, casting glances in their direction. Curiosity piqued, they hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe. The few people who had been passively passing by now stopped altogether, their phones already out, recording the scene as the tension grew. They knew something was happening, something worth capturing. In the digital age, it was only a matter of time before the conflict escalated into something more visible, more permanent. Landon's throat tightened. He had always preferred to avoid conflict, to resolve things calmly, even when faced with unreasonable people, but Helen was pushing him to his limit. Still, he tried to stay composed. He met her gaze, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the heat rising in his chest. "Ma'am," Landon said, his tone trying to de-escalate the situation. "I'll leave if you want me to. There's no need for this." He was hoping to end this as simply as possible, to let the incident fizzle out before it spiraled further. The last thing he wanted was for things to become more complicated, especially with Mia waiting for him. He wasn't here for a fight, he just wanted to have lunch, a quiet moment to catch up with his sister. But Helen wasn't interested in peace. Her lips twisted into a cruel smile, a mocking laugh escaping her that sent a chill down Landon's spine. It was a sharp, grating sound, one that made his skin crawl. It was as though she found his attempts at diplomacy laughable, weak, even pitiable. "Oh, of course," she sneered, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Always so quick to play the victim, aren't you?" Oh my God. Before Landon could even process her words, she moved with sudden, startling speed. Without warning, her hand shot out, slapping him across the face with a force that seemed to echo through the plaza. The sharp crack of impact rang out, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. The world seemed to freeze for a moment. Landon's cheek stung, a hot, burning sensation that radiated outward. His head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, his mind struggling to catch up with the shock of it all. The crowd, which had been murmuring in the background, fell completely silent. People stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened, but feeling the gravity of the moment settle over them. For Landon, the pain from the slap was nothing compared to the shock. He had never expected this. A part of him had thought that the situation could be diffused. He could walk away, let it go, maybe even apologize and make this woman forget it. But the slap shattered that illusion. His mouth went dry and his pulse raced as he fought to steady his breathing. The sting on his cheek was a stark reminder of how quickly things could spiral out of control. Landon's hand lifted instinctively to his face, but he hesitated, aware of the crowd watching him. He stood there, momentarily immobilized by the suddenness of the attack, unsure whether to respond with anger, confusion, or something else entirely. But before he could act, the crowd's murmurs began to swell. a collective gasp of disbelief that spread through the onlookers like wildfire. They had all witnessed it too. Helen had crossed a line, and there was no going back now. The plaza, once filled with the hum of activity, now felt like a silent arena, and Landon, his cheek burning from the slap, could feel the weight of 100 eyes on him. He had hoped for a peaceful lunch, but now the conflict had become something far bigger than just a simple misunderstanding. As the echo of the slap hung in the air, the crowd around them seemed to hold its collective breath. Landon's cheek burned, but the sting was beginning to fade into something colder, more searing. Humiliation. His mind was racing, trying to process the turn the situation had taken, trying to think of something to do, to say, but before he could react further, something unexpected shifted in the tense atmosphere. Landon's eyes caught sight of a figure standing near the edge of the crowd, Helen's teenage son, David. He had been hanging back, awkwardly watching the scene unfold from a distance, his phone in hand, recording the altercation for reasons Landon didn't yet understand. David's expression was strained, his youthful features twisted in concern. David's fingers trembled as he lowered the phone, his face pale and eyes wide with shock. It was as though the realization of what had just happened hit him all at once, and with it, a flood of uncomfortable awareness. The quiet young man, who had seemed detached moments ago, now seemed to come alive with a sudden burst of courage, or perhaps confusion. He took a hesitant step forward, his voice cracking as he spoke, barely above a whisper at first. "Mom, stop," David urged, his words shaky but growing in urgency. "You're taking this too far." "Except," David explained softly. The entire crowd seemed to shift with his words. For a moment, the focus of the plaza seemed to turn away from Landon and toward David, his voice breaking through the tense silence that had gripped the scene. There was a palpable change in the air, like a switch had been flipped, and the dynamic between mother and son suddenly became the focal point. Helen, however, was having none of it. Her head whipped around, her eyes flashing with fury as she locked onto her son, her face twisted with disbelief, as if she had never even considered that David might oppose her. She downloaded. "David, stay out of this," she snapped, her voice low and furious. "You don't understand what's at stake." But David wasn't backing down. His hand gripped his phone tighter, but his voice, though hesitant, was stronger now, more resolute. "No, Mom." He shook his head, the words spilling out. "This isn't about protecting anything. You're just being hateful." The words landed with a heavy thud, cutting through the tension that had been so carefully crafted by his mother. There was a shift in the crowd now, subtle but undeniable. People exchanged glances, the murmurs growing louder as they sensed the unraveling of something they hadn't expected. David's defiance was like a crack in the wall that Helen had built around herself, and the onlookers began to feel the weight of his words, their curiosity piqued. Landon stood still, stunned for a moment by the turn of events. He had been so consumed by the altercation with Helen that he hadn't noticed the silent struggle happening right in front of him. David's voice, though filled with nervousness, carried the weight of truth, and it was clear that it was not just the crowd that had shifted, but the very foundation of the confrontation itself. For Helen, the shift was jarring. Her face twisted with a blend of rage and disbelief, but there was something else there too, something more vulnerable, a crack in the facade of the domineering figure she had projected. David, her son, had just turned the mirror on her in a way she hadn't expected. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a ripple of realization spreading through the onlookers. What had started as a one-sided confrontation was now unraveling, the balance of power tipping in unexpected directions. Helen, whose words had been so certain and commanding just moments before, now found herself being challenged, not by Landon, but by her own son. David's defiance seemed to reach through the thick tension of the moment, and for the first time, the crowd began to see that the real conflict wasn't just between Landon and Helen, but within Helen herself. A mother clashing with the emerging voice of reason in her own child. The moment was pregnant with change, and Landon, though still reeling from the slap, couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, a small but significant shift in the power dynamic. As the tension between Helen and David continued to unfold, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, the atmosphere charged with uncertainty. But then, a new presence cut through the clamor, an authoritative figure that commanded immediate attention. Officer Trent, a tall, well-built man with a no-nonsense demeanor, pushed through the crowd with ease, his uniform drawing immediate respect from the onlookers. As though his uniform was unofficial, it carried enough weight to quiet the growing murmurs and establish an air of control. "What's going on here?" Officer Trent's voice was commanding, a sharp contrast to the chaos that had erupted moments before. His gaze swept over the scene, taking in the crowd, the charged atmosphere, and the two central figures, Landon and Helen. Helen immediately seized on the opportunity to direct the narrative. Her eyes flared with indignation, and her finger jabbed at Landon with an accusatory gesture. "This man threatened me," she declared, her voice dripping with contempt. "He raised his hand to hit me." Landon's mouth dropped open in shock. The accusation was so far from the truth that it took him a moment to respond. He was still processing everything that had just happened. The slap, the verbal assault, and now this. His heart raced as the words hung in the air, feeling like another blow, this time to his dignity. "That's not true," Landon protested, his voice rising with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "She hit me. She's the one who—" But before Landon could finish, Officer Trent was already narrowing his eyes, his gaze flicking between him and Helen, assessing the situation with a look of practiced judgment. Trent's demeanor was calm, almost disinterested, as though he had already made up his mind about who was guilty and who was innocent. Without a word of further investigation, Trent moved quickly, his hand gripping Landon's arm with surprising force. The movement was deliberate and quick, as if to signal that any protest would be pointless. "You're coming with me," Trent said coldly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Landon's heart raced as panic began to set in. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had been trying to stay calm, to handle the situation without escalating it further. But now, in front of the crowd, in front of this officer, it was clear that things were spinning out of control in a way he hadn't anticipated. He tugged his arm slightly, trying to break free, but Trent's grip only tightened. "Officer, you're making a mistake," Landon pleaded, his voice strained with urgency. "I didn't do anything wrong. She's the one who hit me. You have to listen." But Officer Trent didn't seem to be listening. His eyes remained focused on Landon, and his expression stayed cold, unyielding. It was clear that he wasn't about to entertain any further explanation from him. The crowd, sensing the shift in power, became more vocal, but before they could intervene, David stepped forward. His face was pale with nervousness, but there was an unmistakable sense of resolve in his movements. His phone, still recording, was held firmly in his hand, capturing everything unfolding before them. "Officer, I have proof," David said boldly, his voice louder now, cutting through the tension. "He didn't touch her. She's lying. I have it all on video." David's words were a lifeline. Landon looked at him, his chest tightening with hope. The video could be the evidence that turned everything around, but as he watched Trent hesitate, the officer's dismissive response killed any remaining hope. "I don't need a video," Trent said, his tone almost bored. He waved his hand in the air as if dismissing the entire issue. "I saw enough." The finality in Trent's words was suffocating. It was as though the officer had already made up his mind, and nothing, certainly not a video or testimony from a witness, would change it. David's face fell, the video in his hand feeling like a futile gesture, as though not making the gesture had any effect on him, or even on his deceased wife, whose grave was being buried with the rest of her family. Landon's mind raced. the injustice of the situation sinking in deeper with every passing second. He had been caught in a web spun by Helen's lies, and now even the law was on her side. He wasn't sure what was worse, the slap or the knowledge that the truth didn't seem to matter anymore. "Please," Landon said, his voice barely above a whisper, desperate now. "You have to listen." But the officer remained unmoved, his grip still firm on Landon's arm as he began to lead him away. The crowd watched in stunned silence, the dramatic shift in power leaving them unsure of what to do next. The scene, once filled with the heat of confrontation, now felt colder than ever. As Landon was led away by Officer Trent, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, the scene continuing to unfold like a tense drama playing out in front of them. But as the officer's hand tightened around Landon's arm, another figure emerged from the periphery of the crowd, her presence subtle at first, but growing in strength with each step. Emma, an elderly woman with a sharp, determined gaze, pushed her way through the onlookers. Her steps were sure, despite her age, and there was an unmistakable fire in her eyes, a kind of quiet resolve that couldn't be ignored. She had been watching from a distance, observing the injustice unfolding before her. But now, seeing the situation escalate beyond measure, she knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. With a firm, no-nonsense voice, Emma called out to the officer. "I saw the whole thing," she said, her words cutting through the rising tension like a blade. Her tone was calm, but there was an undeniable strength behind it. "And I won't let this stand." The crowd, sensing a new turn in the story, shifted their attention to Emma. She wasn't just another bystander. She was someone who had witnessed the events firsthand. There was something about her presence that demanded respect. She wasn't just some elderly woman with a phone in her hand. She was a force, standing up for what she knew to be right. Without missing a beat, Emma pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with practiced ease. It was clear that she knew exactly what needed to be done. As she dialed a number, her eyes never left Officer Trent or the unfolding situation, her determination unwavering. "Jackson, we have a serious problem," Emma said into the phone, her voice low but firm. "Get down here now." Jackson, her nephew, was a renowned civil rights attorney known for his work advocating against injustice and discrimination. Emma didn't hesitate to reach out to him. She knew that with his experience, he could help Landon in a way that no one else could. Emma had seen enough over the years to recognize a miscarriage of justice when she saw one, and she wasn't about to let it slip by. As she hung up the phone, she looked back toward Landon, who was still being escorted by Trent. Her expression softened for a moment, as if offering a silent reassurance to the young man caught in the middle of this storm. "Don't worry, son," she murmured under her breath, though no one could hear her but herself. "Help is on the way." The jailers. In the brief moments before Jackson arrived, Emma stepped closer to the officer, her voice carrying enough authority to make Trent pause for a brief second. "You're making a mistake, officer," Emma said, her gaze unwavering as she looked directly at Trent. "You're taking this young man without even hearing the truth." The crowd, sensing a shift, grew more restless. The phone footage in David's hand and Emma's wordless protest had added layers to the situation that Officer Trent hadn't expected. And now, with Jackson on his way, the officer knew that things were no longer as simple as they had seemed. Emma's intervention was a turning point, and the scales of justice might not be so easily tipped in his favor anymore. With one last look at Landon, Emma turned her focus back to the officer, prepared to stand her ground as the next phase of the confrontation loomed. The battle for truth and justice was far from over. Landon sat in the dimly lit holding cell, the harsh fluorescent light flickering overhead as his mind raced, each thought colliding with the next in a chaotic storm. The cold metal bench beneath him felt as if it were sinking into his bones, amplifying the discomfort that had settled deep within him. His cheek still throbbed from the slap, but it was the sting of humiliation that burned the deepest. It was a humiliation that stretched far beyond the physical pain. It was the sense of being trapped, accused of something he hadn't done, powerless in the face of a system that seemed to turn a blind eye to the truth. The small sterile room around him did little to ease his mind. The walls were bare, the air thick with the smell of old, stale coffee and disinfectant. There was no warmth, no comfort here, only the sound of his own breathing and the occasional shuffle of footsteps outside the door. He shifted uncomfortably on the bench, his thoughts tumbling over each other, but they always returned to the same question. How am I going to explain this to Mia? His stomach twisted at the thought of his sister. She had been looking forward to their lunch together, a moment of calm amid their busy lives. Instead, here he was, locked in a cell, accused of something he hadn't done. Mia would never understand how it had escalated so quickly, how a simple lunch had turned into a nightmare. She had always been there for him, a constant source of support. But what could he say now? Could he even find the words to explain how he had gone from being an innocent bystander to the one being hauled off by the police? He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the image of his parents drift into his mind. His mother, always so careful to avoid conflict, would be heartbroken to hear about this. His father, on the other hand, would be furious. He could already hear his father's voice in his head, demanding answers, demanding to know how this had happened, how his son had ended up in this situation. Landon's chest tightened at the thought, would they even believe him? Will anyone believe me? The question echoed louder now, gnawing at him. He had been accused of threatening Helen, of raising his hand to strike her. It didn't matter that the evidence was clear that it was she who had struck first. In the eyes of Officer Trent, the damage had already been done. The officer had seen enough, had made up his mind before he even bothered to listen to the people who had witnessed the truth. Landon's fingers gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles turning white as frustration bubbled up within him. He had been trying to remain calm, trying to believe that the truth would eventually come out. But now, sitting here in this cold, sterile cell, surrounded by the unrelenting silence, he wasn't so sure anymore. Was there any hope of getting out of this? Was there any hope of things returning to normal? His phone was gone, taken by Officer Trent when he was dragged away, and all he could do was sit there, waiting, hoping for someone to intervene. Emma had made the call to her nephew Jackson, and while he hoped that the civil rights attorney would arrive soon, a dark thought crept into his mind. What if it was too late? His head sank into his hands, the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the feeling of being alone, truly alone, was suffocating. He had always tried to stay calm in the face of adversity, but this felt different. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? How had he gone from a simple lunch with Mia to sitting in a holding cell fighting for his freedom? The sound of the precinct door clicking shut echoed through the quiet hallways as Officer Sarah Daniels returned to the station, her shift having ended hours earlier. She was tired but sharp, her mind still preoccupied with the case she had left behind for the day. As she passed by her desk, she noticed the pile of paperwork awaiting her attention. One file in particular caught her eye, a report about the incident in the plaza earlier that day. Her curiosity piqued. Sarah picked it up, flipping through the pages. As she read through Officer Trent's notes, her brow furrowed. Something didn't sit right. The narrative seemed too one-sided, too rushed, and the details didn't match up with the account she had heard from the initial radio transmission. There were no witness statements included, no mention of any videos or other forms of evidence. Just a straightforward account that Landon Parker had been taken into custody for threatening a woman and raising his hand against her. But Sarah, with her experience, could sense the gaps, the subtle discrepancies that were begging for closer inspection. And as it happened, she knew Trent had a reputation for making quick judgments, often jumping to conclusions without gathering all the facts. But this felt different. There was a weight to it that made her pause. Something about this case didn't add up. And Sarah wasn't the kind of officer to let things slide when she felt that gut instinct tugging at her. Without wasting another moment, Sarah walked down the hall toward Trent's office. As she entered, she saw him sitting at his desk, his usual air of authority and confidence barely masking the tension in his posture. When he looked up and saw her, his expression hardened slightly. "This story doesn't add up," Sarah said curtly, her voice even but firm. "Why didn't you take witness statements? Why wasn't there more of an investigation?" Trent, clearly caught off guard by her questioning, shifted in his chair, his defensiveness creeping into his tone. "I saw what I saw," he replied, his voice clipped. "End of discussion." Sarah's eyes narrowed. She wasn't satisfied with that answer, and she wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. She had been around long enough to know when something didn't feel right, and the more she thought about it, the more it gnawed at her. This wasn't a case of a simple misunderstanding or a routine arrest. It was a situation that had the potential to escalate, and she needed to get to the bottom of it. Refusing to back down, Sarah left Trent's office, her mind already moving toward the next step. She needed to talk to the witnesses. She needed to hear their side of the story. As she stepped outside the precinct, she made a quick call to Emma, the elderly woman who had reportedly witnessed the confrontation in the plaza. When Emma answered, her voice was calm but firm. "I saw everything," she said, without hesitation, "and I'm not letting this go." After arranging to meet Emma, Sarah headed to the woman's apartment, where Emma was waiting, ready to tell her side of the story. Emma explained everything in detail, recounting the moment she had seen Helen slap Landon and how she had witnessed the whole thing unfold. Her words were steady, but there was fire behind them, a conviction that Sarah couldn't ignore. Sarah listened carefully, asking a few clarifying questions, then turned her attention to the next crucial part of the investigation: David. Emma had mentioned the young man had recorded everything on his phone. When Sarah reached out to David, he was more than willing to cooperate. He sent her the video footage from his phone, showing the confrontation in real time, with Helen slapping Landon and the escalating tension between them. As Sarah reviewed the video, the truth became clear. The footage contradicted the narrative Trent had written in his report. Landon hadn't raised a hand to Helen. He had been attacked first, and the entire scene had been distorted by her lies. Sarah's heart began to race with the realization that they had gotten it wrong, that the system had failed Landon. Determined to correct the injustice, Sarah called Emma back, her voice filled with resolve. "I've got the video. I've got your statement. I'm going to make sure the truth comes out." The weight of the situation was settling in. Sarah knew she couldn't let this go. Not after everything she had seen. Not after hearing the witnesses. There was no turning back now. The tide was turning, and she would do everything in her power to make sure Landon's side of the story was heard. The air in the precinct felt different now, tense, but also filled with the quiet weight of anticipation. Officer Sarah Daniels stood in the small office, staring at the screen in front of her, her hands gripping the desk. The video footage from David's phone played on a loop, each frame confirming what Sarah had already suspected. Landon Parker was the victim, not the aggressor. The evidence was undeniable. She dialed the phone, her fingers trembling slightly. It was time to make things right. If she were to be right. At the holding cell, Landon sat on the cold metal bench, his mind still clouded with uncertainty. He hadn't spoken to anyone since the incident. No phone calls, no updates. He'd been left to stew in his confusion, his frustration, and the gnawing sense of helplessness that had taken root inside him. The stale air, the harsh lighting, it all felt like a reminder of the injustice he was experiencing. The door to his cell opened, the sound of the key turning in the lock breaking the silence. Landon looked up, surprised to see Officer Sarah Daniels standing in the doorway, a quiet but determined expression on her face. For a moment, his heart skipped a beat. Was it a mistake? Was he being transferred somewhere else? But as Sarah stepped into the cell, she looked directly at him, her voice calm but filled with sincerity. "I'm sorry for what you've been through," Sarah said, her tone apologetic but resolute. We're going to make this right." Landon's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. The words felt surreal, as though they were coming from someone else. He had spent so much time doubting if this day would ever come, if the truth would ever be acknowledged. But now, standing in front of him, was the officer who had taken the time to dig deeper, to look at the evidence, and to understand the truth. Sarah's words were a balm to his raw emotions. She had seen through the lies. She had heard the witnesses. She had reviewed the video footage that told the true story. And now, Landon wasn't just a man wrongfully detained. He was a man about to be freed. "You're free to go," Sarah said, unlocking the cell door and stepping back. "You've been wrongly accused, and we've got the evidence to prove it." The weight that had been pressing down on Landon's chest for hours began to lift as he stood up, disbelief still hanging in the air. He couldn't quite process the relief yet, the sudden change from being trapped in a nightmare to standing on the precipice of freedom, now climbed in silence moments with her that went on forever. It was more difficult than he could ever have imagined. But as Sarah led him through the hallways of the precinct, the reality of the situation began to settle in. Helen Stratford would be held accountable for what she had done. The charges for assault were already being filed against her, and the investigation into Officer Trent was underway. In the days that followed, the story of the wrongful arrest and the injustice Landon had faced began to spread. Helen was exposed for what she had done, and the community that had once stood in silence now rallied behind Landon. For Sarah, it wasn't just about clearing one man's name. It was about restoring integrity to a system that had failed him. Trent's actions were under scrutiny now, and while the road ahead would be long, Sarah knew that Landon's release was just the beginning. The truth was out, and it would not be easily silenced. As Landon walked out of the precinct, the cool evening air hit his face, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he breathed deeply. He wasn't free of the pain, the uncertainty, or the anger that had built up over the past few days. But as he stepped into the future, the weight of the injustice was finally being lifted, piece by piece. There was still a long road ahead, but now, at least, he knew he wasn't walking it alone. The weeks that followed Landon's release were a whirlwind of media coverage, public outcry, and a new sense of purpose. With Jackson, the renowned civil rights attorney, by his side, Landon took the first step toward holding those responsible accountable. A lawsuit was filed against Helen Stratford for assault and the police department for their mishandling of the case. The ripple effect of Landon's wrongful arrest spread far beyond the confines of the plaza where it had all begun. The story quickly went viral, sparking heated debates about racial prejudice, systemic injustice, and the abuse of power. News outlets, social media platforms, and activists rallied around Landon's cause. The video evidence, combined with the testimonies of Emma and David, became a rallying cry for those who had long felt silenced by a system that favored the powerful over the vulnerable. Landon, once a man caught in the web of an unjust system, had become the face of a larger movement. But while the external support flooded in, Landon couldn't escape the quiet battle inside his own mind. As the case made headlines and his name became synonymous with justice, he wrestled with a lingering trauma that no amount of public backing could fully erase. The sting of the slap, the weight of the false accusations, and the hours spent locked in that cold cell haunted him still. Despite the swelling chorus of support, a doubt lingered in Landon's heart. As he prepared for the trial, the voices of doubt whispered louder with each passing day. "Even if we win," Landon thought to himself one night, sitting alone in his apartment, his gaze distant. Will anything really change? It was a question that gnawed at him, a question that extended beyond his own case. In a world so deeply divided, where systemic inequalities seemed ingrained in every layer of society, Landon wondered whether the victory he was fighting for would be enough. Could one case, one victory, shift the tides of injustice? Or was it a fleeting triumph in a system built to maintain its power? The morning of the trial arrived, and the weight of the moment settled in like an unspoken truth. Landon stood in the courtroom, dressed in his suit, but his mind wasn't on the formalities of the day. It wasn't about the charges or the legal battle. It was about the message, the larger fight for justice that had come to represent so much more than just his own experience. As he took his place in the witness stand, his gaze briefly flicked toward the door. His parents were in the audience, their faces a mixture of pride and concern. David and Emma were there too, standing in solidarity, the community that had supported him now as much a part of the fight as the legal team. But outside the courthouse, beyond the walls of the legal system, a crowd had gathered. Hundreds of supporters filled the streets, holding signs, chanting for justice. Their voices echoed into the courtroom, a reminder that this was not just Landon's fight. It was the fight of countless others who had been silenced by prejudice, by lies, and by a system that often failed to protect the vulnerable. The camera panned out from the courtroom, capturing the crowd rallying outside. The sea of faces was a mixture of hope and determination, an embodiment of a community that had come together to demand change. It was a powerful image, the quiet strength of Landon standing in the courtroom, and the resounding roar of the people outside, united in their call for justice. And as the camera pulled back further, the question lingered in the air, unanswered yet unavoidable. Would this moment, this victory, be enough to spark real change? Landon's heart ached as he took his seat, but the fire within him had grown. It wasn't just about his personal battle anymore. It was about something bigger, about the countless others who had been pushed aside, dismissed, and silenced by a system that was never meant to serve them. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. And in that truth, there was a quiet kind of hope. A hope that, even if the fight seemed endless, each step forward, no matter how small, could ignite a change that would ripple through the years to come. The courtroom doors closed, but the fight for justice had only just begun.